Okay, 1 Peter chapter 3. So, before we start really diving into things too much, we'll try and shake the cobwebs out on a Sunday morning. 1 Peter is about the subject of suffering, and it's specifically focuses on the idea of suffering in a godly way. There's a contrast made between godly suffering and ungodly suffering, suffering for doing the right thing and suffering for doing the wrong thing. And as we finished up chapter 2, the prime example of righteous suffering is brought up at about verse 21, and that's Jesus. You look at Jesus, he did nothing wrong, and yet nobody suffered more than him. And so there is a little bit, I guess, if you were to graph it out, it seems there is a pattern that we see that the more righteous you are, the more you need to be expecting to suffer for that righteousness. So there is a very real day-to-day reality that we as Christians have to understand, that it's not all fun and games down here. And there's definitely living in a broken world with problems and people who are opposed to Christ, and just a world that is not conducive to righteousness. You're going to deal with a whole variety of difficulties. And along those lines with the idea of suffering, one of the words that is brought up is submission. And it's talked a lot about in chapter 2, in particular submission to governing authorities and all of that. When you get to chapter 3, we start looking at submission in particular in relationships, starting with the husband and the wife relationship. But if you were to really simply put it down, what seems to be the pattern you see in 1 Peter 3 is just submission equals suffering. If you are going to submit, you are going to suffer in this life. And so, as we shake the cobwebs out, here's my question for you. Why? Why is submission and suffering so closely tied together? What would be some reasons for that? Yes. It goes against your will. Yep. Is that what you had, Gwen, too? Yep. Goes against your will. Anything else? Why might submission cause suffering? It's not just me, so I don't get what I want all the time. That's a factor. Yep. It might be hurting some. Yep. So sometimes you're going to have to choose that submission over other people that you care about. Jesus brought up that idea that you've got to love me more than father or mother or brother or sister. So yep, that's one of those. Any other reasons submission here on earth might cause problems? Yes. Yep. Yeah, so if you submit to Christ, you're going a different direction than everybody else. Wide is the gate to destruction, narrow is the gate to salvation, few are those who find it. And you're the salmon swimming upstream. Yep, absolutely. How about, in 1 Peter, it doesn't just talk about submission to Christ, it also talks about submission to human beings or human institutions. How might that cause suffering? When you're submitting to the government, or you're submitting to your spouse, or submitting to the needs of others. Yeah, so when you submit to a boss, everybody has perfect bosses, right? Never have had any sort of problem with those in charge. You always would do it exactly the way they do it, right? Yeah. Yep. Yeah, submission. Yeah. That's the crossroads of it, isn't it? I mean, if if you are on the same page every step of the way, there really isn't a need to submit, right? So submission is the idea of placing underneath, and I think Matt has nailed it right on the head too. That's the moment where you have somebody who says, I would do it this way, and you would do it another way. Submission is what you do at that point. So it isn't submission unless there's a disagreement. If you remember when we were in chapter 2, one of the things that it talks about servants being submissive to your masters, not just the reasonable ones, but the unreasonable ones as well. So that's another aspect of it, is that sometimes we're submitting to unreasonable people. Now, my wife has never had an unreasonable husband. Why are you chuckling? But I've heard such things. I've heard legend of unreasonable husbands that wives have had to deal with. And so, that is part of life, right? It's part of life of dealing with, whenever you're dealing with people and authority, you have a tricky thing to deal with because they won't always be reasonable. Okay, so in 1 Peter chapter 3, the first two relationships that are dealt with there, so we've dealt with in chapter 2, we've dealt with submitting to human institutions, kings, governors, and those in authority. We've dealt with servants and submitting to masters in verse 18 of chapter 2. Chapter 2, verse 21 kind of gives us an aside to remind us why we submit, and the answer is Jesus, right? So Jesus submitted, and we might add, Jesus submitted to people who were not of the quality of him. Jesus submitted to the authority of the Caesar and told others to do likewise. Who's the better man, Jesus or Caesar? It's just a no-brainer, right? So if it works for him, it works for us. And we're also reminded there at the end of chapter 2 that submission in these things is ultimately about our submission to Jesus. So in chapter 3, it begins with wives, and so we'll do the same. And there's really 4 different characteristics of wives that and what it looks like to submit. In the same way, you wives, be submissive to your own husbands, so that even if any of them are disobedient to the word, they may be won without a word by the behavior of their wives. So number 1, it talks about a wife who's married to a husband who's disobedient to the word, meaning he's either not a Christian or he's living at that moment in an un-Christ-like way. So we're now dealing with an unreasonable, right? Then it says, verse 2, as they observe your chaste and respectful behavior, your adornment must not be merely external, braiding the hair and wearing gold jewelry or putting on dresses, but let it be the hidden person of the heart with the imperishable quality of a gentle and quiet spirit, which is precious in the sight of God. So there's 4 particular traits that I'm going to highlight here. If there's another trait in there that somebody sees they'd like to take a moment on, go right ahead and let us know. But the first one is chaste. What does it mean to be chaste? What?
Somebody's trying to...
Oh, man. We're supposed to leave comments like that for Pam. That's not... That's the other chaste Todd.
How about innocent or modest?
Yes, thank you. Yes, okay, so the idea of innocent or holy or pure. Not unbelievable. Too many fathers in this class that have jokes like that. Okay, so here, you think about that first characteristic right off the bat. The idea of being innocent or pure or holy, that chaste. In society right now, are women taught to be chaste, innocent, pure, and holy? That's like when you see magazines with women on it, that's totally the look they're going for, right? See the problem? it's like Reggie was saying, you're going exactly the opposite direction of the world. The next one is respectful. Now, that word for respectful is an interesting word. It's phobos, and it's where we get the term phobia from. So you are supposed to, as a wife, have a phobia of your husband. It's the word for fear. But, of course, it's the word for fear that's used in a generic sense in a lot of different places. So one, it can mean fear in the sense of the way somebody might be afraid of snakes or spiders. Is that the sense, does that match the tenor or the teachings of the Scripture for this case? That's not at all what we're looking at. In fact, when we get to husbands, one of the things that husbands are supposed to be doing is honoring their wives and dwelling with them in an understanding way. If he's doing that, does it even make sense that she would be afraid of him in that sort of terror sort of way? So that's not what we're looking for. The sense that we're looking at here would be more along the way of, say, Acts 2:43, which translated as awe, or Romans 13, which talks about rendering fear to whom fear. That idea of really what we would call respect. So there's a reason that even though the Greek word is phobos, phobia, where we get that idea from, it's translated in most translations as respect, because we're not talking about fear in the sense of terror, but in the sense of a respect for him as a man. Now, for those of you who were in the marriage class, this got talked about a lot. Is every man respectable? Are husbands always behaving in respectable fashions? No. But if a wife gives him respect that he has not earned, but offers it to him anyways, she is offering him a gift. And that, by the way, is what submission is when you are offering a gift to somebody. Because when we submit as Christians to the governing authorities or things like that, if we submit to the U.S. government, we're placing ourselves underneath them, even though, are we really underneath the U.S. government, or do we have a higher king? A much higher king, right? So what she's doing is she's offering him a view of him being a better man than what he currently is. Now, there's a practical side to this, which is if a woman treats a man like he is a really impressive individual, what tends to happen to us guys when we are treated like we're really important? Our head gets big. Well, yeah, that's true. It could be in a bad way, but it can be in a good way. Somebody else have something? You strive to be that way. A good man, hopefully, will not become arrogant, but he will strive to match that picture that she has painted for him. So there is that idea of respect. And now, once again, in the culture that we live in, in our current culture, how respectful of men is the culture today? It's not. Right? The culture makes fun of us. We're a bunch of doofuses. Right? If you watch a sitcom or something, in the marriage, who's the one who always is the idiot? It's always the husband. Right? And so it's that going against the tendencies of the world. The next one is gentle. Somebody describe what gentle means. Yes. Yes. Instead of blowing up, right, you wait to cool down, and you have a gentle approach to the problem. I knew it was coming. I thought that is such a perfect comment from Pam. Something's coming. Yes. So yeah, it is. It's the idea of waiting just to say it in the right way. You think about like a cleaner. If you have a gentle cleaner, like if you have a spot on a couch, I'll tell you exactly how you can get rid of it. If you got a spot on your couch at home, I know exactly how to get rid of it. Blowtorch will do the job. That spot will be gone, right? No problem. But so will the couch. So gentleness is using just enough abrasiveness as what is necessary, but no more, right? And I really like Pam's comment because in a marriage, you're going to have times of conflict. I had an older couple tell us one time when Jen and I first got married, they said, you're going to fight in your marriage, just make sure you fight fair. And I've remembered that over the years. Like there is a way to go about disagreeing, and then there's a way not to do it. And that gentleness is, okay, we're going to talk about this thing of disagreement, but let's find a way to do it in the least abrasive fashion possible. Now compare that to the Proverbs, and when Proverbs talks about women in the foolish woman, she's very abrasive, right? That drip, 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 drip of Proverbs, right? I'm gonna keep nagging until I get my way. Once again, it's the opposite of the world's pattern. The next one is quiet. In 1 Timothy chapter 2, verse 2, this exact same word is used, and it means, there it's translated peaceable is the idea. So the idea of quiet in this sense is you're not picking a fight. You are, as much as depends on you being at peace with all men. I might mention, as we look at all these characteristics of wives, the focus is on wives right now, but chaste, respectful, gentle, and quiet, would that be good for all of us as Christians to be? Is there a single one of those traits that you go, no, men don't need to be gentle, or peaceable, or respectful, or chaste? It's good for all of us. Why in particular would the emphasis be here on women in this case, though? Since it's something we agree everybody should do. Okay, so women are more reactive in these particular areas, and so this is something particularly a temptation for wives to not do this. Yeah, I would tend to agree with that what you're having is a focus due to these are the areas that we tend to fail in our roles as husband and wife. Anybody have anything they want to add to that when we look at the role of the wives? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yep. Yep. Absolutely. And anytime you're in a submission role, these are really great characteristics. Okay, am I doing these things? Because you're right, we're all in submission roles at certain times. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. No, and that's a great point. If you're going to lunch with your friends and talking bad about your spouse, I mean, it's that does harm in its own way, right? And yes. Yeah. 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 Because if your thought is, I'm going to do this until it works, right? I'm going to do it until the person changes. Then there's this manipulative aspect to it. And then inevitably the person doesn't change fast enough, right? But if you do it for God, you say, this is the kind of person God wants me to be, then but it's hard. It's really hard to be a cheerful giver when you feel like sometimes you're not seeing the results that you want. And I joke about Jenna at least has a reasonable, perfect husband, but obviously I know that's not true. And there have been times where she's been all of those characteristics, and it should have moved the needle with me as the leader of the household a lot faster. And it just doesn't always work that way. Any other comments or questions or anything like that? Oh, yes. Mm-hmm. Yep, absolutely. Yep. So then you move on to the husband's roles, and you get down about verse 7. He says, you husbands in the same way. So what's interesting here when you have this in the same way, if you start in verse 1, it says, in the same way you wives. So what we're talking about is different kinds of submission. So in the same way that Jesus submitted, wives are to submit to husbands. But then in verse 7, you husbands in the same way, live with your wives in an understanding way. There's a type of submission that husbands are doing that is different than the submission the wives are doing, but is still a form of submission, which is, should husbands put their needs, if submission means to place underneath, should husbands be putting their needs or desires beneath those of their spouse, of their wife? Absolutely, right? So if it's done right, this is why I point out this in the same way. If it's done right in a godly marriage, both of you are submitting. You're both submitting in different ways. The roles are different. You know, in the beginning, God made them male and female. You probably noticed men and women different. But you're both submitting. Now, the ways in which he submits, there are several key things that come up. One of them is that he is to live with her, and that's a single Greek word, which means to dwell in the home of, or to dwell together. And it's one we jump over a lot of times. But in verse 7, you husbands in the same way, live with your wives in an understanding way. If your thought as a husband is, the way I'm going to deal with my wife is, I'm going to she can be over there and I'll be off with the buddies and I'll be doing my thing. You are not fulfilling your submission. You are to dwell with her. Now, it's a very common problem that we have in the world today, where you have marriages that are just two people kind of living in the same house. But there's not a marriage per se. It's just they just kind of happen to share a room. But here he's saying, no, husbands, you live with. And I would say the tendency, because just like with the characteristics with a wife, these are dealing with temptations for a woman. One of the temptations for men is, it's like, well, now I got her to say I do, so I'm off with the buddies. Right? I'm off doing my own thing. And he doesn't give her time. Do wives need our time? Just checking, right? They absolutely need that. So if you as a husband say, well, you know, I pay the bills, I keep the lawn mowed, I clean up my clothes, and you have a list of physical things that you take care of, but you don't give her your time or attention or anything like that, you're not fulfilling part of that living together standard, that example that we're given. Anybody else have anything on that one? Okay, then the next is understanding. How many men, raise your hand, men, if you have trouble understanding women sometimes? If you do not have your hand up, you are lying. You just don't know what you don't know. Right? It's a struggle. Women think different than men. Not bad, just different. My wife is much more in tune with people, and I'm much more in tune with things. And it's just, I think, a natural tendency of male and female. And I know I'm talking in generalities. It's not always that way. But as a general rule, you know, my daughters, I will never forget, there was a day we were over at some people's house, and there were a bunch of kids playing, and my daughter was the only girl. So there were like 4 boys playing. They're all little, 2, 3, something like that. They're all playing, and there are toys everywhere in this room. And the kids are running around and playing, and all the boys, they have taken all the toys out, and they're just kicking them around the room. That is all they're doing. I was looking to see what their method of play was. That was entirely it. We're just going to kick these things and yell like T-Rex. And then I look over in the corner, and Holly is in the corner, and she's playing with cars. I go, oh, I didn't know she liked cars. I mean, so I kind of have that dad, like maybe we'll have this thing. And I go over and say, oh, what are you doing? She goes, this is the daddy car, this is the mommy car, and these are the baby cars. She's just more relational. And I think as a general rule, that's the case. That's not bad. That's just different. So if you're going to dwell with your wife, you need to dwell with her in a way that's understanding. And so you have to, how do you understand? How do you understand anything? Listen. That's the number one rule. You want to understand something? Listen. So husbands, God gave you 2 ears and 1 mouth. Use accordingly. Right? Listen to your wife more. She's going to say some profound things if you'll actually slow down and listen. She's going to say some things that have never crossed your mind if you slow down and you listen. And then you're going to understand. And then you can dwell together in a way that makes a whole lot more sense. So that understanding is huge. And once again, we're just talking about these as general principles. But how much of life is affected by if you wake up in the morning and as a husband say, I am going to make sure that I understand my wife better by the end of the day than I did at the beginning of the day. How would that change the way you lived? Anybody have anything else to add to that? Okay. The next one is honoring. Show her honor as a fellow heir of the grace of life. So here, and by the way, I'll take a moment to deal with the controversial part of this verse where it says, as with someone weaker. People get really caught up in that idea of as with someone weaker. I might remind you, as we look at it, it says she's weaker, but she's equal. Okay? An easy way for me to think about that is I have a lot of 5-gallon buckets, and they're very strong, but you don't use them to eat off of. Fine china is much weaker than all of the tools that I have out in my garage, but they're of oftentimes a lot greater value, if anything. So just because something's weaker doesn't mean it's bad. There's a lot of things in life that are weaker that are actually we value much higher. And so here, though, he says honoring her. So you honor her as a fellow heir of the grace of life. So you don't. She does not get an asterisk next to her Christianity. Right? She's not. Well, there's me as a Christian, then she's a Christian too, but right, fellow heirs of grace of life, both going to the same place, both serving the same Lord. Jesus paid the equal price for her sins as he paid for your sins. So that idea of honoring is deference or to put a high value or price upon something. So as you think about your wife, men, do you place a high price on her? Do you value her highly? If she needs something, how important does fulfilling that need become to you? Right? How important is her sense of security or safety? How important is it to you that her needs are met? That's the idea of honoring. We had a way as a society, we used to do this all the time, we don't do it quite as often, but when you would go to a dinner table and a woman would stand up, what would the men do? Men would all stand up. When a woman went to sit down, what did the man typically do? He'd get her chair and push it in for her. Now, I don't know anybody that thinks that women can't push their own chair in. We're not doing it because they're incapable. But it's a way of honoring, a way of placing a value there and visibly showing that. So that idea of men doing that, I think, some of those just good old-fashioned manners things, it would be great if those came back, I think. You want to really blow some people's mind, pull your wife's chair out for her every time she goes to sit down. It'd be impressive. Anybody have anything they want to add to the honoring? Reggie? Yeah. That's right. Yep. Yeah, I don't know if everybody heard that, but that idea of an elder telling this young preacher, you get out of the car and you go and you open your wife's door. And it's little things like that. I will say, opening the car door for my wife, that was something my dad taught me very early on. My dad and I are so bad at it now. When we go places, it's like the mental habit. I've opened the door for my dad. And then he gets in and goes, oh, thank you. And so, but it becomes muscle memory, but it's a good muscle memory, those sorts of things. And they make a difference in a marriage. Those little points of contact, those little small acts of honoring, I think are a really, really big deal. Yes? Mm-hmm. No, I think there is a huge confusion. Let me give you an example. There was a young man who came over to my house one time, and he was interested in a young lady, not my daughter. But he came over and he was asking my advice. He wanted to take her out on a date, but he was terrified because he didn't know, should I pay or not? And his worry was, he says, that if I don't pay, I come across like I don't care about her and I'm not willing to provide, and I'm just a cheapskate. If I do pay, I might offend her thinking that I'm the boss or something. And that's that is indicative of a societal confusion, right? What is the right way to handle all this stuff? And we have young people who have to navigate those waters. And I think what we need to do as Christians is emphasize the world is confused on this subject. And men and women are completely confused, and they're being taught from a very early age very confusing things. So let's get back to the Word, and let's just do that. And if it would be honoring for you, if that's a way for you to honor her is to pay for the meal, then just do it. And if she doesn't like that, well, then there's other fish in the sea. You know, I mean, but it is confusing, and it has created a sense, I think, for young men and young women of landmines. They don't know where to walk and what to go. Yes, and then yes. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right. 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 Yep. Yep. Yes. Yeah. Well, and like you said, you were saying earlier, that's the confusion. It's like, which one is it, right? So the culture is wrong. Yeah, absolutely. Did you have something? Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm. Yep. And that, we do need to be honest about that creates a major problem. Because and this is that problem, right? It's, if you want to lay it all on the blame of women or you want to lay it all on the blame of men, good luck. Because there's plenty of blame to go around when we don't follow the biblical model. When a husband doesn't lead, he creates a vacuum. I remember one woman telling me one time, she goes, I want to have him lead. I want to follow him, but he doesn't get off the couch. Somebody has to pay the bills. Somebody has to, and she's right. You know, if a man won't step up and lead, you know, science tells us that the world doesn't like a vacuum. You can't, if there is nobody leading, somebody's going to have to step up and do it. And it does create a problem that way. Keith, did you have something? Yep, it is. It's a good rule of thumb is that if you're always putting yourself first and you're happy, but you're not thinking about them. Yep, that's a good way to think of it. Okay. Phil, what time do I end? My brain just froze. In 2 minutes. Okay, yeah, that's what I thought. What? I got 5? Okay, and then I got 5 minutes. Okay, so yeah, good luck covering the rest of this chapter in 5 minutes. Okay, the last thing though is prayerful. It is implied, in my view, that when it says, show her honor as a fellow heir of the grace of life so that your prayers will not be hindered, that the implication is what should a husband be doing? Praying, right? And that was mentioned earlier. You should be praying for your spouse, praying for your marriage. I don't know whether this is just my experience or not. So it's anecdotal. So I can't tell you whether this is just true across the board. But it seems to me, as a general rule, women are much more prayerful than men. I don't know whether that's just my experience or not. But as the leader of a household, and you have to lead your family, nobody should be more prayerful than us to reach out to our Maker to help us with that leadership role. And so just something for us to consider as men is, are we prayerful leaders of our family? The next one then is, in verse 8, he says to sum up. And in there he's going to list a variety of things. All of you be harmonious, sympathetic, brotherly, kind-hearted, and humble. So to sum up means, look, this is everybody. Everybody should be this way. Harmonious has the idea of being of one mind or shared thinking. You think of things that are in harmony. They're not the same note, but they harmonize. We should try and harmonize with one another. This is not just in marriage, this is in all relationships. So try and get our thinking to harmonize. You probably heard the saying, you got your wires crossed. Right? That's where you're not thinking the same and you're not connecting. We should try and connect and understand each other. And along those lines, you have sympathetic, which is to feel together. And so these two are put next to each other, and I think it's a really cool thing. We're told, try to think together, and then also try to feel together. Now, you think about churches. If you have a congregation, and they think together, so we make sure we're always thinking and getting all the doctrine bits, and we get all of that squared away. We all think together, but we never feel together. Meaning we have no emotional connection to each other's successes or losses. We're not going to get very far. On the other hand, if we feel together but we never think together, I care about you and I feel when you are successful and I'm excited about that, and I feel when you have losses and that matters to me, but we don't ever try and talk about doctrine or truth or think together in a harmonious way and harmonize with the Word of Christ, you're going to have some problems. You need to have them both. And here at Eastland, we talk a lot about being a family. In a family, you do that, don't you? You have to get on the same page mentally. Okay, this is what we're doing. This is what our goals are. This is where we're going. This is the rules. But then you also have to have that feeling together at the same time. So the next one then becomes brotherly. That is where we get the city of Philadelphia, brotherly love. It's that idea of to love as brothers, to love as family. That's one of the goals that we should have, is to love one another. Well, how do I know that I love you? Do I love you like a brother? Kind-hearted means to be tender, or the very literal translation of kind-hearted is to have strong bowels. That's a mental image, isn't it? Kind-hearted means to have strong bowels, to feel deeply. This idea of feeling deeply with one another really ties to that idea of being sympathetic again. That we should have a heart for people. In a book that's about suffering, guess what happens? if you have a heart for people, guess what you're going to have happen? You're going to suffer, right? Because people suffer, and you're going to suffer with them, and people will break your heart, and all those things come together. And then the last one is humility, to be humble. That's a deep sense of one's own littleness. And so we're going to stop there.